Do we have monitors or do we turn them on?
Planning Commission for the City of Wilsonville on October 9th, 2019 is now in order. Will our clerk please call the roll?
Chair Greenfield.
Here.
Vice Chair Postma.
Here.
Ron Heberlein.
Here.
Peter Hurley.
Here.
Cameron Mesbah.
Here.
Phyllis Millen.
Here.
Simon Springall.
Here.
Thank you.
Please rise for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
For the record, this is a time when citizens have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not scheduled for a public hearing tonight. There is no such hearing scheduled. Therefore, if any member of the audience would like to speak about any work session item or any other matter of concern, please raise your hand so that we may hear from you now. I see no one in the audience, so we'll move on. Beginning with a consideration of the meeting minutes for what was
September 11.
September 11. No, it was, yes, September 11, 2019. These have been previously distributed. Are there any corrections or additions to be made? Hearing none, the minutes are approved as distributed. We have one item scheduled for tonight in our work session, and that is a residential code modernization project, which we've considered previously and are going on. We'll want to introduce? Our Planning Director Miranda Betchel will introduce the staff on this report.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chair Greenfield, Commissioners. As you'll recall, we've been working for several months now on the Residential Code Modernization Project. We've been here previously for work sessions around the density calculations and lot size, as well as open space requirements. And so tonight, Daniel Pauly, Planning Manager with the city, will be walking you through some lot standards that would also need to be modernized in order to correlate with some of those additional requirements we've previously discussed. So there'll be information about lot coverage ratios as well as the relationship with accessory dwelling units, and walking us through where that would apply and where it would not apply within the city. So with that, Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you, Miranda, and good evening, Planning Commission. I am going to rely on the mic heavily tonight. My voice is not at 100%, so let me know if you can't hear me. I will try my best. So, work session number 4, here we are. And I wanted to start just every time we have these work sessions, I like to go through briefly what the background is, where we're coming from, as this will relate also to a number of things that we'll talk about this evening. The focus of this project is the Planned Development Residential Zone, which is the zone that's applied to the majority of the residential land in Wilsonville outside of Villebois and Frog Pond. This code as a whole was last updated in around 2000, with some significant updates in 2005 around open space codes, as well as revisions driven by state law changes and other things around accessory dwelling units in 2010 and 2019. In that, since this was updated, we've also updated some other, adopted some other residential codes. The village zone was a specialized zone for Villebois, adopted in 2003. And then most recently, the residential neighborhood zone for Frog Pond was adopted. So it's important to understand the role of both the village zone and the residential neighborhood zone as we look at this project, particularly the residential neighborhood zone, as a lot of what we're doing is modeled on this zone. And that makes sense, as really what the residential neighborhood zone is taking the best components of the lessons learned in the village zone and what has worked well in the PDR zone, and then bring in some model codes and best practices researched by the consultants to create a zone that so far seems to be working pretty well. This project then takes out some areas of the PDR zone that have come up as problematic over the last couple decades, then really replace those with what we have come up with the residential neighborhood zone, and then integrate any other lessons learned or best practices. So in that context, after an introduction, we talked first about density calculations and lot size, which was one of the most substantial changes or issues identified in the PDR zone. Make sure that those correlate correctly. Then most recently, we talked about open space requirements. And tonight, we're going to talk about these lot standards, as Miranda mentioned. And also, again, want to emphasize that this doesn't apply or isn't expected to have an impact really on the existing residential development, as those are all planned unit developments, and those standards adopted with those planned unit developments will continue to apply in most of those neighborhoods. Really, the areas that this is anticipated to most directly affect over the years is the residential land owned by Mentor Graphics just north of the town center, residential land south of Wilsonville Road at Montebello. Time frame for development of both those fairly large parcels is unknown and is really driven by choices made by the property owners. And also additional redevelopment of some larger parcels along Canyon Creek Road South that, based on past patterns, anticipate to continue to redevelop over the years. And as with any project, again, revisit why we are doing this. This code is a couple decades old. We've found some issues over those decades, and just want to continue to improve and have the best code we can have. Also with residential code, law and best practices point towards being more clear and objective. Also want to make sure that code we have is feasible to implement. And also there's been a pattern where Wilsonville, these codes were really originally written with this idea of these large master plans, which is still applicable in some instances, but also as Wilsonville ages as a community, there's more opportunity for infill and more pressure for infill. So make sure that the codes are also appropriately tailored to accommodate smaller projects within those zones. And really, I wanted to emphasize that tonight is, in a lot of ways, a continuation of that lot size discussion from a couple work sessions ago. However, there was a lot of things we talked about that night, so want to save something for later. So this is really what that is. And really, it's looking at, we talked about what the lot sizes should be in each of these zones and how it correlates with the densities on the comprehensive plan. But really, this now goes into make sure that all those standards that are directly related to lot size, such as setbacks and lot coverage, but also things like lot width, lot depth, and also unrelated, but always grouped, is also building height. So those are the sort of things that we'll look at tonight. A key takeaway and thing to keep in mind from the work a couple work sessions ago under our recommendation is that there's some adjustments to the minimum lot size a number of the PDR zones recommended. And this really is based on some analysis where we looked at a 10-acre site with the required 25% open space and the typical amount of infrastructure, and seeing at the maximum lot size, maximum density that's allowed, what would an individual lot lots equally divided actually be. And looking at that and with a few minor adjustments, came up with new minimum lot sizes for each of the PDR zones listed here. And so really then the exercise tonight is to make sure that our other standards we have for lots in these zones work with these new minimum lot sizes. Another component of this, following, again, after the, so currently, let me step back here. So currently, the lot standards for the PDR zones are written out in text form and really repeat a lot of the same things 7 times in the code. In both the residential neighborhood zone as well as the village zone, these same sort of standards are presented in a table format. I really want to go along that same way to save a bit of room on a screen or just be easier to navigate for an applicant. And because this is also what I've typically seen in other jurisdictions, residential codes, these sort of standards are presented more in a table format. So taking all of that text and putting it into a single table, which we'll get into more, is one of the main steps that's proposed with this package I'm talking about tonight. So this is the proposed table, and I'll just go over, we'll get into more detail, but I'll just go over what the different columns are. So we have the zoning designation, the minimum lot size that we discussed a couple work sessions ago, setbacks, a maximum lot coverage, a minimum lot width and street frontage, minimum lot depth, and also building height. So now I want to step through each of these and highlight what's not changing and then what is actually having a bit of an adjustment. Starting with setbacks, no change to recommended changes to setbacks. Looking at this and the feasibility and such of building, there hasn't been any particular issues besides developers wanting less setbacks identified that would lead us to want to change this. So no changes recommended there. Those are in a different section of the code, the cleanest way without having, because you want to avoid having the same standard twice in the code, because then if it gets off kilter, it's better just to reference it. And so the table just simply references that section of the code that has setbacks for all the residential properties. Similar with minimum lot width and depth, no change there. All those still work are possible to meet at the new minimum lot sizes. And the footnotes listed here, A is about you can having lot frontage on a private drive. B is about lot frontages being able to be reduced on cul-de-sacs. That's all current language, is not proposed to change.
Why is the footnote B not used with the other 3 PDRs?
Because that's reflective of the current code.
Okay, so it's just no change.
No change. It just puts the current code into table format. And as well as no change to the maximum building height. Most of the lot coverages also don't change. PDR 1 and PDR 4 through 7 aren't proposed to change from the current code. I would particularly note on PDR 4 and 5 that 75% lot coverage hasn't really been used much because most of those subdivisions that exist in those zones today were built prior to 2000, where in that 2000 code work, these lot coverages went up substantially from what existed for the standards in the 80s and 90s. Really, then where the changes are focused, as far as this table goes, is on the lot coverage for the PDR2 and PDR3 zone. Excuse me, my apologies. But these actually don't necessarily change. It's just clarification of where it correlates with different lot sizes. And I have a table here to kind of lay that out a bit more for you. So in this table, the columns, you have, again, the zoning designation and lot sizes. But then this compares the different, first of all, what the current lot coverage is in the zone, and that's just based on the zone title, then what is actually a lot that size would be under the current code, regardless of kind of blind of the zoning designation, and then what it would be for that size of lots in the residential neighborhood zone, and then what's proposed. The thing you'll notice here is with that adjustment, particularly for the PDR2, going down from a 12,000 square foot minimum lot size to a 7,000, really takes up a wider range of possible lot sizes. So you need to accommodate that range better in the table. So for 12,000 plus, so this is really that range, 12,000 to 20,000 square feet is the same as current code, so that's just moved over. Then these others also are the same as the current code, with the caveat that the additional lot coverage for accessory buildings is added in, which is reflective of the RN zone, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But so you'll see that 40% stays the same with the addition of the 10% for accessory buildings. And that's for 8,000, 12,000 square foot lots. Some to 8,000 square foot lots goes up to 45, and then 55 for all buildings. And then for less than 7,000, 50% with an added 10% for accessory buildings. So let's talk a little bit then about accessory buildings and the different language and approach in the current PDR zone, as well as the residential neighborhood zone, and then what's recommended. Again, the recommendation here is to follow the model of the residential neighborhood zone. That said, there's been some questions or interpretation questions from some of the initial builders about the language in the RN zone. So recommending a slight tweak of that language for the PDR zones just to remove that question that some of the developers had, which was essentially what some of the developers tried to say there is that if I have like a 10 square foot accessory building, that allows me to apply that extra 10% to any building on the lot. So, you could use that 2% of your bonus for a shed, but then add 8% more to your house. That's what they tried to argue. So this removes our understanding and is that 10% can only apply to accessory buildings. So just making that clear. So let me step back though, before we get into that. The current PDR zone really differentiates between residential dwelling units and then all buildings. So shed, a couple of things that have come up here. First of all, in some of the older areas where this is used, it's a question whether or not a garage, even an attached garage, is a dwelling unit or part of the dwelling unit, and it's not necessarily consistent whether or not that's considered part of that lot coverage. And also the fact that this approach was used prior to really the consideration of accessory dwelling units in the code, both as something that's becoming more of a potential and interest in the market, as well as, of course, being driven by state statute and rules. So then in the residential neighborhood zone, similar approach, but again, it's a lot coverage, then the bonus is for all accessory buildings, even if that may be an accessory dwelling unit. So that's really the difference there. So the recommendation then is to build on that and say your largest building gets one lot coverage. So typically that's going to be the primary dwelling unit. I think in 99.9% of the cases conceptually I can think of cases where that wouldn't be the case, but I don't know of anywhere that's actually been built rather than the primary dwelling unit, and the attached garage would be the largest building on the site. So that would have the lot coverage, and then any other buildings or accessory or secondary buildings on the site, regardless of the use, would be allowed that 10% bonus. So whether that's a shed, a detached garage, or an accessory dwelling unit, or a pool cover or whatever, would fall under that extra 10%, which is how we understand the residential neighborhood zone to be today. The other thing to consider is this footnote where lots large for a zone, where really, because these zones set a floor for lot size, but they don't set a ceiling. And so what you do when you end up with a lot that's larger than typical for that zone, or a subdivision of lots that are higher than typical for a zone. So for example, casual observer probably doesn't know that Wilsonville Meadows and Courtside Estates have a higher zone density than Renaissance at Canyon Creek or Maury's Landing, even though they have similarly sized or larger lots. And really how that happens is, as part of larger master plans, the density is averaged with adjacent multifamily. So in the example of Wilsonville Meadows, the density was averaged with the adjacent apartment complexes as they were all originally master planned together. Or Courtside Estates was averaged with some of the condos that are adjacent over here.
You weren't here, of course, at that point, but was this not an issue at the time? The way that inclusion skews the lot size calculation?
It was, I think at that point, back in that point, the lot coverage wasn't that different, because I mean, right now from like a PDR 3 to a PDR 4, I mean, you jump like 25 to 30% lot coverage. That differentiation, as I understand it, really didn't exist in the 80s and 90s. And so it didn't really, to my knowledge, I mean, I've read those staff reports over the years, but to my knowledge, that didn't come up as an issue. But yeah, because I mean, currently, if Wilsonville Meadows was developed under today's code, it would be allowed a 75% lot coverage because of the PDR4 zoning. So the proposed note would simply require that lots follow the standards of a zone where a larger lot size would typically land without the density average. So essentially pushing lot coverage to more correlate, not necessarily to the zone, but of the size of the lot. Which, is, first of all, a couple other density averaging examples just to show some maps. It was used to some extent with the redevelopment of the Thunder Hood Mobile Home Park, where you have single family mixed with the multifamily. Another kind of classic example is the PDR4 zoned, which you have those pretty large lots there at the end of Lejos Drive, which the density was averaged with the adjacent sundial apartments to allow the lots to be that large. So a couple examples. And staff feels that it is important to address this in this code work, because those two of the sites, the Mentor property just north of town center, as well as the property at Montebello, are large enough to potentially do a density averaging sort of exercise and end up, though both of those are zoned PDR5, would be PDR5 or PDR4 likely, they could end up with some larger lots through that density averaging process if they were to put in multifamily or something at the same time.
Dan, the density averaging, though, can happen on a smaller scale as well, right?
Yeah,
didn't
it could happen on a smaller scale. Like the Vallejos example was that's a fairly small scale. I mean, that's what maybe.
I was thinking in the Frog Pond area, we got some pretty large lots, and then in the first area to be built, that was Street of Dreams.
Yeah, well, in the Frog Pond case, that was purposeful, is during the master planning, kind of that density averaging happened during the master planning, and the property owners or developers that had, options in different areas expressed, as I recall, expressed interest in, what size of lot they want on their property.
Yeah.
And so there were some other considerations like, properties that were closer to the edge or closer to amenities ended up being denser, but we don't anticipate that type of density averaging happening on that scale in Frog Pond because it was kind of considered as it was master planned.
Right, okay.
With that, kind of what's next, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Following tonight, through the rest of October and November, we'll be doing some outreach around these topics and what we've talked about over the last few work sessions. And then we'll have a final work session anticipated in December, where we will review the feedback that we've received, go over the highlights of the project again, and then go over the final recommendations to carry forward to a public hearing and adoption in the first quarter of 2020. So questions and comments?
So I have a comment on the table for the maximum lot coverage table for PDR2. So if you go back to the, I guess the main table, the previous couple of slides. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
So I like this table. I think it makes the whole code, like you say, much more readable and compact. And the huge cell in the middle that's highlighted on this slide is you can. I wonder why you're using different wording styles for those three different categories of lot coverage. The 25 to 30 versus the 40 to 50 versus 45 to 50. You could make all of those more compact by giving the range like you do on the third section inside. What I mean is 45 to 50 says 7,000 to 8,000 square foot lot. That's it.
Right.
Why don't you say 40 to 50, 8,000 to 12,000 square foot lot? Or is there a reason for all those extra
There
words
is a
in
reason.
there?
So, yeah, it's, because you have to be precise on those margins. Otherwise, you get into extended conversations with developers and other interested parties. So that is more, again, reflective of how it's broken up in the current code. So for 45, it simply says 7 to 8,000. But you can't say 8,000 to 12,000 because then if I have an 8,000 square foot lot, which category does it go in?
But Dan, you could put it at 8,001
Yes.
to 12,000 and
Well, but you can have
12,001 to 20,000.
8,000.0001. So.
So, yeah.
Oh, does the code have a rounding
We could put a
calculation?
rounding footnote as an option, yes.
Yeah, and in mathematics, you have open versus closed ranges, right? So you could get all to that technical level of detail, saying inclusive, or you could just use the word inclusive.
Yeah,
or
we'll look at potentially a footnote or another way to, because yeah, it would look cleaner like that, but.
Well, so the first sub-bullet in that cell is most verbose, the second one is kind of medium verbose, and the third one is compact.
Yes.
Could use mathematical symbol for larger than,
Yeah, less than or equal.
but most people don't know what it means.
So, and I'll tell you that my original version on this that I was working with did have a lot more symbols than words, but then I ended up writing it out for this purpose because yes, it was just like 8,000 plus or plus 8,000 dash 12,000 or something like that, or the greater than symbol. So. When you start working with attorneys and stuff, you're gonna, attorneys tend to like words sometimes. I don't know. I'll look at Amanda.
But to be clear, the numbers here on either side of the slash correspond to the categories on either side of the slash in the heading. Is that correct?
Correct. And I can go back to one without the highlighting, so it's probably easier to read. And then it has all the footnotes as well.
All right, I got a couple things, Dan. Note C, I think the third word is likely to be must instead of most.
Yes, thank you.
Probably my most value-added contribution tonight, but I'll continue anyways.
Good catch.
How did I miss that one?
Second question was relating to the Note B identifications on just PDR 3 and 4. When I was reading through that, that threw me for a loop as well as to why that wouldn't be on PDR 5. Is there a justification for that? It seems like there would also be a desire to be able to reduce the lot frontage on a 2,000 square foot lot if it fronts a cul-de-sac as well.
I asked that question and you said that there's no change.
Yeah, it is more approach of if it's not broken, don't fix it. So that's how the current code is. I've never received a complaint otherwise, so. I think also when you start getting a lot large enough for that to be an issue, because I mean, when you get down to the PDR 5, you're at a 30-foot minimum lot width anyway. And if it becomes an issue on a cul-de-sac, usually your lot's going to be larger on a cul-de-sac, so it'd probably push you into those PDR 4 standards anyway. Because, I mean, if your lot's over 3,000 square feet in a PDR 5 zone, you're going to be pushed into that PDR 4 standard, and it would subsequently apply.
Okay.
And then, you know, PDR 2, PDR 1, it's large enough that it doesn't matter.
Even though there's no change, it seems to me good use of ink to put that extra notation on the footnote for those, for a PDR, at least for PDR 5.
Yeah, I would say that at this point, staff had not included it in the proposed edits because it hadn't come out as a direct conflict in our current application of a code. It didn't seem to be one that we'd kind of dealt with or had become a conflict or conflicted with anything we were changing. However, we are doing a modernization and changing policy through this process. So if it is something that the Planning Commission felt they wanted to add to the list of proposed modifications, we are here for your input, so.
This is the form that people will see.
Yeah, certainly, and I could see that, why doesn't it apply? It's easy to just put the B next to the rest of those, so, yeah, easy enough to do.
Is 24 feet actually ever the case?
I haven't gone out and measured,
narrow
but
edge.
that'd be pretty narrow, because, I mean, yeah, you think a typical two-car driveway is going to be at least like 18
Right,
feet.
you could scarcely get a driveway in that
Yeah.
frontage.
So, yeah, I'm not familiar with that ever, and that's probably why it's never become an issue, so, that anyone's brought up to us.
One more, and then I'll almost promise that I'll be done. So with PDR 1, 2, and 3, you have, I'll say, a gradual step down in maximum lot coverage. And then when you go to PDR 4 and PDR 5, they're the same, although your minimum lot size is different.
Yes.
Is there a rationale for why PDR 4 wasn't, say, 65 or 70, where PDR 5 is 75, so that there is still a gradual change in maximum lot coverage?
You know, besides concern about downzoning or being more restrictive than current zone, it's, it again, a couple notes here. First of all, the under 4,000 square foot does not exist in the residential neighborhood zone. So there's nothing to like compare for the residential neighborhood zone. And 75 is the current standard. And again, don't have a compelling reason for it to not be. Again, this is where you're looking at a lot less than 4,500 square feet. So you're looking at a fairly small lot at this point in a PDR4 zone. So you're going to tend to have a house that occupies most of the lot.
And I'm not sure we know 100% what the intent was when that change was made, because that was back in 2000, correct?
Right. That was late in the...
I would imagine it was done that way because they were smaller lots and felt like a 75% coverage was more reflective of the lot size. I don't know that we have a full answer to your question in terms of why PDR4 isn't slightly different than PDR5 or 6.
Okay.
Perhaps it was to accommodate detached rows.
Yeah, it could be detached. However, you still have setbacks. Two-story, it still has a 7-foot setback and less wave here in these zones. So, I mean, that alone would kind of reduce your
Lose out
lot
rows,
coverage.
yes.
Is
and
the actual physical setback requirements.
I guess when I was looking through the PDR zones, I could see a clear difference between PDR 1 through 4, but then when I look at PDR 4 through 5, the only difference is a 5-foot difference in minimum lot width. And then my question was, well, what's the real purpose of having PDR 4 and PDR 5 if there's virtually no difference between the two?
Good question. A couple thoughts there. So first of all, the reason that 75 is a maximum is just that notion that you want 25% open space, even on an individual lot, at least not occupied by buildings. So any lot, the maximum lot coverage you're going to get is 75. So really that notion that at PDR4 you hit that ceiling, so any of the denser zones, you're already at that ceiling, so it's not going to change. Why they exist is because there's those differentiating densities on a comprehensive plan, and you need a corresponding zone where that works.
Yeah, I guess in the changes and the reduction in the minimum lot sizes, though, you've reduced the difference between the two PDR zones by making these changes, and it just,
So
we don't have to do anything about it. It just seems like there's an unnecessary zone.
Yeah, well, in terms of this table, there isn't much differentiation, but in terms of, you do end up, back to calculating the density and seeing how many actual units are on a given parcel, it would make a difference. From practicality, there is nothing zoned PDR7, and I don't anticipate anything being zoned PDR7, but it's on the books and it doesn't hurt anything to carry it over. PDR6, while that zone does exist currently, none of the vacant parcels that we anticipate this applying to are zone PDR6 or would be anticipated to be zone PDR6 based on the comprehensive plan density. So they're there to reflect the current zones and what's currently in the comprehensive plan, but really it's that PDR4 and PDR5 where we're most likely to see development. PDR3, PDR4, and PDR5 would be those areas that are circled red on the map. Those would be the zones that would actually be used. However, we have all these current zones, and kind of the decision, as I recall, when we went back to a couple work sessions ago, is there's not a compelling reason not to keep our current zones. I mean, you could cut it, slice the pie a number of different ways, but kind of the simplest solution is to keep our current zones, our current comp plan densities, and really solve the equation from there to make sure the regulations work for those. Because that's really the question people are asking is, I have this piece of land zone this, what can I do on it? And so we're trying to make sure that that answer is clear and feasible.
Are there any other variables defined by the zones than those affecting lot size and density?
Not really. So in a lot of ways, the PDR could in a lot of ways be considered a single zone that's differentiated by density and then by some differing than lot standards based on that density, which is similar then to the RN zone where you have the sub-districts that have differentiated standards based on the anticipated lot sizes.
Where does building height come into play, into consideration?
Typically, we don't get 35 foot. I mean, that really would probably more come. I don't recall ever getting a single family application of a 35-foot high house. That really would come more into consideration in a multifamily development.
You ever visit Philadelphia, go see the Trinities, the
Yes.
3-story residences.
And we've seen some conceptual ones in Villebois that may get up there, but that was by purpose because they were around the piazza and the design standard there is to have a tall structure. But
if someone proposed a 2-story home over a 1-story garage, making a total of 3 stories, is that permitted?
yeah, as long as it's 35 feet or less. And, in certain zone, in the RN zone, for example, you have some standards about garages and the percent of the facade that can be a garage. So you might run into standards like that, but as well as in Old Town, there's some standards about the garages. But, in terms of building height, yeah, that'd be allowed.
Any other questions for Mr. Pauly? Any comments?
Yeah, I just one more thing on the table. Sorry, it's all about the tables, and I like tables. Page 7, slide 7 rather. The comparison with the comp plan is still interesting to me because
This one right here?
Yeah, it demonstrates that we still have gaps in the comp plan. For example, between 7 and 10. Density between 12 and 18. Are they not filled in by PDR 4 and PDR 6 or?
They're not filled in. So it really comes down to how it really works in reality is that, mathematically, yes, it'd be nice to have a continuous, no gap.
Right.
But the reality is the comprehensive plan districts give you these ranges and really you also work with the minimum is always the 80% of the maximum. So you end up, once you identify a maximum density, your range isn't that big. And where this comes in is if you try to take, let's say you go and draw a subdivision and say, I want my subdivision like this. I don't know what the density is. And then you try to fit that subdivision into a zone, it may not fit perfectly because, now my density of this subdivision I drew without really thinking about where it might go ends up being, let's say, 5.5 dwelling units per acre. And magically, that falls into this area that's not addressed in the code, so what do I do? Right? That would be, but that doesn't really happen in reality, per se, typically, or.
If it did happen, could it be handled by waiver?
No, because you're complying with the comp plan, because what typically happens on the other hand is somebody has a property or a developer's interested in a property, they say, what's the density? How much can I get based on the zoning? And then they start their design from there based on that density. So they start knowing what their minimum and maximum is. So they're not trying to fit it in somewhere into a gap. They know what it is and they're designing accordingly. So from that point, functionally, the gap is not an issue.
Right.
Where it could be an issue conceivably, or not necessarily an issue, but I think one of the discussion points, I can't remember if it was the first work session or the second work session, we actually discussed this issue for quite a while, because I believe the initial proposal provided actually a proposal to fill the gaps. And at this point, because we don't have anything zoned according to that, or necessarily land with that comp plan designation, there isn't a clear purpose to it. However, it could be that if we wanted those densities in potentially new urbanizing areas or areas that currently have like our holding zone, but we might want to apply, say, a 15 to 18 density range district, that we don't currently have a designation for that. And if we created one, then at that point, if that's what we did want to apply to that land, we would actually have a comp plan designation that we could basically amend its comp plan designation, which would then relate to a new PDR designation. We had a discussion at length about the need to do that, the desire to do that, and I don't think the planning, as I recall, the Planning Commission did not come to a clear consensus yet on what direction they wanted to go with that. So that is still on the table. I mean, that is something that as Dan prepares to bring back the final recommendations and to go out to do some outreach, is that if we wanted to incorporate some of that information back in to fill those gaps, we can bring back to you recommendations that have those proposed edits in that. But I think we'd look to you at this point, this evening, to provide us with some direction on that, whether you see value in filling those gaps within the comp plan density range districts.
Or it could be kicked down to that point where, let's say we decide that, which would take an action by council and likely some changes to the comprehensive plan that go through the commission anyway. So that may be a more apt time to say, okay, we've decided that there's a strong policy reason to this product type that just fits better at this 15 to 18 density. So as we change the comp plan, then we could easily plug that into what we have existing. But again, when we go back and circle where this will actually apply on the zoning in our current city, is any of those other filling those gaps really wouldn't impact anything, have a real impact on the ground.
I do remember the discussion about the new PDR zones, because they were really hard to understand your naming convention. I remember that. So, but I guess if it's not required, like you say, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So I get why you're saying, well, the gaps aren't really an issue because the developer just works with what they've got to work with and it goes from there. So, okay.
Any other thoughts from the commission on that point, just to make sure we're clear? Because that has a pretty big impact on this project if we're going one way or the other.
My sense of it is that there is sufficient variability, variety provided in the existing zones as they're now being defined. Why do we need a more fine-grained continuum? So what we're looking at here is really kinds of neighborhoods, and being able to distinguish a neighborhood built to a 10 to 12 standard or a 14 to 16 standard doesn't seem to be a very big difference. People going through those neighborhoods wouldn't recognize the difference, probably. So as far as the way the city looks and feels, seems to me that this is sufficient variety.
Just so long as we can continue to have a sufficient variety of building, housing types and housing prices, like we talked about this the affordable housing thing, providing a variety of housing styles, and as long as that continues, that we're not able to build certain types of housing in demand because the zoning doesn't allow it, then that will be a problem.
But we're still not talking, right, about Frog Pond and, Villebois close to build out, right? But so we're still only talking about limited infill areas, and we have a pretty good practice of when we're adding substantial land to master planning that separately, like we did for Frog Pond anyways, right? So
Yes.
we're really talking about limited areas, so.
Those of you that continue on the commission will have plenty of opportunity to discuss that in the coming years.
And again, why are you looking at me?
Because you were just talking. I know. but
No, thank you, Eric.
That
Good
wasn't
point.
why I was looking at you, Eric.
Anything else? Do you have anything else for us?
No, thank you for your time.
I think we're at a wrapping point. Thank you. We see this once more, don't we?
Yes, in December. And then once more for
And then a hearing. I would, before we quite leave it, have we received significant community input about this outside of this room?
We've received some feedback from the Home Builders Association, but really the idea is here, some of these ideas were, on one hand, it's so tailored to a specific thing, but also the idea is we wanted to kind of get the commission's overall feedback and guidance before we go throwing out ideas out to the development community and they say, I like this, but, so at this point, we've gotten some clear guidance from the commission. And so now over the next month and a half, we'll take this out to the community and get their feedback and then identify in December if there's any issues or it gets substantial feedback from the community that something's wrong with what the commission's discussed.
How about the owners in these zones?
The owners in the zones, they can certainly be notified. We'll be sure they're on the notice list. I mean,
They just haven't yet, but obviously you're going to.
yeah, that'd be part of the outreach would be to these owners.
And I have another general question. Do the changes here apply to an owner's redevelopment of his own lot? Any lot? That is to say, for example, those large lots over there on the end of Vallejos, which could presumably stand more building. Do those come under new guidelines, or are they still under the original zoning for that?
They would be under the planned unit development for that subdivision. And you'd have to modify the whole thing to do anything differently.
But if somebody came into an established neighborhood and wished to aggregate and redevelop, what would this require rezoning that property?
Not necessarily. We really haven't run into that at this point.
Are we going to run into it in connection with town center redevelopment?
Those areas are not part of the town center.
No.
Not identified as part of the town center. So again, the land use approvals is what currently guides what's allowed to be done there.
Right, and we're not finished with that.
Yeah, so, I mean,
Finished with what?
Pardon? With the zoning of town center.
The town center zone was adopted through the town center plan project. The town center plan zone has its own zoning
Right.
designation and regulations.
Use and so forth.
Correct. And so do not have PDR within the town center zone.
Right.
So these would not apply there.
None of those zones have to do with the residential, with the established residential zones.
yeah, so like courtside estates and such are not within the town center zone.
Okay, then thank you very much. I have the city council action minutes for their two meetings that have already taken place in September, or I guess one meeting in September and one meeting just occurred.
Also in
Oh, they're
September.
both in September. We haven't got the November meeting or the October meeting yet before us. Any comments on those minutes to take back to council?
Welcome to our new councillor.
Yes. And
I have a quick comment on the Dial-A-Bride Committee outreach. And I know this has to do with...
Hey, Phyllis, you want to turn your mic on?
Oh, my mic's not on. Oh, sorry. Okay. I had a question about the Dial-A-Ride Committee outreach. I know that we were, when the transit plan was being discussed, the issue of Dial-A-Ride was in there as something that was in, I guess I would use the word in jeopardy at that point in time. Is this is this effort to see what's happening with the Dial-A-Ride, or I guess I was just curious what was going on with that.
Did you hear the presentation?
I was going to say, we can have somebody at SMART to give you feedback. I do know that we are in the process of signing an agreement for grant money for Dial-A-Rides. I don't know the extent of what this particular action item is, so we can get some more feedback for you on that.
Thank you, because
Yeah, I was going to say with House Bill 2017, there's additional funding now that SMART's receiving that helps with some of that first mile, last mile connections, additional service. So I know they're expanding service of a number of their bus lines. I believe that's also helping expand the service of Dial-A-Ride. I'm not 100%, so we will make sure to connect with SMART staff, get some information, and have that information sent out to all of you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, next month we have a couple of informational items of interest. And our work session will be devoted to the bike ped bridge. The
I-5 bike.
Yes, over I-5. The French Ferry Bridge will be considered in the information section, but it was announced at City Council, or at least in the work session at City Council, that we've maybe got a bit of a setback on the funding of the bike ped bridge, the French Ferry Bridge funding. Is that correct? Did I misunderstand that?
That's something that we'd have to get back to you as well. I'm not certain on the status of that. And the project manager has actually been out of the office. And so both of those items, while I believe would still be appropriate for at least an update at your next session, I'm not sure the content of the work session item on the I-5 bike ped bridge at this time.
And when is the next meeting of the equitable housing strategy?
Sometime in December. I don't think it has been decided yet.
We'll be updated on that in December. Okay.
Yeah, currently it is tentatively scheduled for here in December. There's some additional outreach. We got some good input through the Let's Talk Wilsonville platform, as well as through the work with the task force, but there's some additional outreach that the project team would like to do to make sure we have a more holistic picture before bringing the draft work plan to the task force, planning commission, and city council.
Good.
I see in the city council discussion, there was mention of the multi-city equity summit. And is that applicable to the attendees of the task force to try to see if you could attend that?
No, I'm registered to go to it.
You are registered.
Where is that?
It's in Lake Oswego High School
High school, Lake Oswego.
in October.
And it's Lake Oswego, Tualatin.
Westland and Wilsonville.
And another.
Is it Tigard as well?
Tiger too, yes.
And Westland Wilsonville School District.
Get information from you about that.
It's, yeah, I have some information on it too. It's free registration, I understand.
It's on the city website as well, as one of the events.
Okay, then I think that, is there anything else for the good of the order? Being the case, then our session is adjourned at 7:01. I think this is a record.